Now, when you buy the Sega Genesis that comes with Sonic 1, you'll get Sonic 2 absolutely free.
If you've been following this channel for a while, you know that I am a major Sega fan. But that does not mean that we can simply turn a blind eye to Sega's questionable and often illegal past. While it's true that pretty much the entire Japanese gaming industry was founded on crime and extortion, today we're going to mostly focus on my favorite gaming company, Sega. Hayao Nakayama was Sega's president from 1984 to 1999. Although he was more focused on the arcade gaming scene, it was under his presidency that Sega launched the Master System, the Mega Drive, the Game Gear, the Sega Saturn and the Dreamcast. However, Nakayama was known as a ruthless businessman, and that ruthlessness extended to his own employees. Recently, Time Extension interviewed Tom Kalinske, who was the CEO of Sega of America between 1990 and 1996. In his interview, Kalinske stated that Nakayama would often engage in verbal and physical abuse towards his employees.
Every Monday, Nakayama-san would go into the so-called decision room, where he would meet with the key staff, and he would beat the hell out of all of the managers and directors over and say things like, "Why can't you guys get the revenue up like Tom has in the United States? Why can't we more successfully compete with Nintendo, like Tom in the United States?" Tom Kalinske, Sega of America, CEO 1989 to 1996.
Reading this, one could assume that by beat the hell out of all the managers and directors, Tom means verbally berating them. That in of itself is already a problem, but not unheard of in the corporate world. But further down the interview, Tom clears any misconceptions from what he meant.
Well, if you're one of those managers sitting over in Tokyo, and every Monday you're getting the hell beaten out of you and yelled at by Nakayama, and he was very physical. I saw him in meetings literally slap subordinates. Tom Kalinske, Sega of America, CEO, 1990-1996.
So this means that during this time, if you worked as a manager or director for Sega, every week you would be subjected to verbal and physical abuse by your boss. And I think it's safe to assume that some of this behavior would be passed down towards the rest of the staff. After all, if the owner is publicly berating and slapping directors and managers, what's to stop those same directors and managers from doing the same to those directly below them? It's safe to assume that this style of management would carry on until you would eventually reach the bottom of that corporate ladder. But as bad as this is, we've only scratched the surface.
Suddenly the sky is a little clearer. The water is a little bluer. The roads a little bumpier. The jumps are hard. The levels...
I think it's fairly well known that Sega used to have ties to the Yakuza, though they were far from the only ones. The truth is, just about every major gaming company in Japan had ties with Japan's underworld at one point or another. Even Nintendo at one point had love hotels and ties to gambling. In the book, The Untold History of Japanese Game Developers, one Japanese developer stated that the arcade industry is covered by the laws that rule the entertainment and amusement trades, and as a result, arcade companies were often subject to the same regulation aimed towards the adult and pink industries, meaning that arcade companies became fertile money makers for the Japanese underworld. The Japanese developer even states that the only companies that managed to stay clean during this period were Namco and Nintendo. And indeed, it does seem that during the 90s, Nintendo's ties with these crime families seem to have dwindled, whereas Sega's had only gotten stronger. And nowhere was this more evident than with Operation Midnight Shipping. As the launch date for the Japanese Super Famicom approached, Nintendo had over 1.5 million units pre-ordered, but the initial shipment would only consist of 300,000 machines. Worse still, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi and his right-hand man Hiroshi Imanishi got wind that the shipments were going to be intercepted and stolen by the Yakuza. So their plan was to quietly ship the consoles in secret and high into the night, avoiding the usual work hours that they would have used before. Luckily, this plan worked and people would receive their shipments. Now, as it's often the case with these things, it's unclear whether this attempt was tied to Sega or not. Even now, 30 years later, people still refuse to give the names of individuals and companies during interviews, and even when these are given, they will have the names redacted before their release. But it's also pretty clear that Sega would have greatly benefited from a botched Super Famicom launch in Japan. Whether or not they had a hand in this, or if it would have just been a happy coincidence for them, is something that remains to be seen. But as mentioned before, and as we'll see further on in this video, Sega had, and likely still has, strong ties to the Yakuza. Though, then again, I'm fairly certain that this applies to just about every Japanese gaming company today, even family-friendly Nintendo. But again, we'll get to that later. This next issue has been confirmed to have happened to Sega, but also involved other Japanese gaming companies and tech giants like Sony, Hitachi, and Konami. Basically, whenever a worker was deemed problematic, whether due to a poor attitude, poor work performance, or any reason that the managing or directorial staff deemed worthy, they would be forcibly put in isolation. Sega would put the employee alone in a room and give them nothing to do. They would even be brought to a different floor so that they wouldn't walk by their co-workers. And this would be their entire day, sitting alone in a room with nothing to do or anyone to talk to. And very likely, no internet, no phones, just complete solitude. No distractions, no work, nothing. This behavior can honestly be seen as not just a form of imprisonment, but even a form of torture. And their main goal with this practice was to force the employee to resign and find work elsewhere. And in fact, the reason why I'm singling out Sega was because that during the 2000s, some ex-Sega staff members took Sega to court and won. One staff member would later say,
Sega would put employees alone in a room and give them nothing to do to make them resign. Former Sega employees sued and won and were issued a public apology. They didn't just put people behind a partition, they sent them to a completely different floor. Sega didn't just lose a lawsuit over this, their image was completely tarnished. Nobody wanted to buy games from a company like that.
As far as we know, the practice of forcibly isolating employees is no longer used by Sega or any other Japanese gaming company. But it's honestly appalling to think that this went on for years and it required a company being sued and having its public image shattered for the industry at large to realize that they couldn't keep doing this. And I just hope that this has not been replaced with some other practice that also needs whistleblowing.
Sega's the best video games you can buy.
Sega's excellent.
It's better than like Nintendo.
It's fantastic. If you're not playing these games, you're a giant loser.
In the book, The Untold History of Japanese Game Developers, one developer recounts the story of how his sister was kidnapped and held captive by the Yakuza at the request of a leading Japanese game company. In the book, the names of the developers and companies have all been changed or redacted, but in this case, the developer stated that the company in question hired gangsters to kidnap his sister to get him to stop cooperating with a rival company. As a means of fighting back, the developer bought an arcade machine from that game developer and hired a truck-mounted crane to drop the arcade cabinet in front of their main offices where it was smashed. He then sent them a letter stating that if they did not release his sister, one of their employees would be next. Okay, can I just pause for a moment and say how much of a giga chad this dude was? Like, damn dude, someone needs to make a game out of him. But probably not Sega. But more importantly, this gamble seems to have paid off. It seems that the mix of public embarrassment and threats were enough to convince them to release the developer's sister. I mean, can you imagine if an article came out saying that Yu Suzuki or Yuji Naka went to the hospital because they were attacked by some rando on the street, and it turns out that their parent company kidnapped the sister of the attacker? This had the potential to destroy their public image not just in Japan, but everywhere, in the entire world. So what does this have to do with Sega, you might ask? How do we know that it was Sega and not some other Japanese gaming company? Well, for one thing, the developer was threatened because he was cooperating with Nintendo, so we know that Nintendo was not behind this, and that it was a company with a vested interest in preventing any support to it. Of course, that alone does not mean that it was Sega, but this is not where the evidence ends. The developer also mentioned that this company had a practice of confining unwanted employees in quarantine rooms and give them nothing to do, all while cutting them off from everyone else within the company. Now, that alone also does not mean that it was Sega, and as we've seen before, Sony also had a habit of confining its unwanted employees. However, the developer also confirmed that this company was taken to court around the year 2000 because of this practice and lost. Now, why does that seem familiar? The developer also let it slip that our headquarters was near an airport, and Sega's headquarters, are you ready for this? Is not near an airport. Yeah, I bet you did not expect that, huh? Sega's headquarters is not near an airport, because during the 2000s they changed locations, but their old headquarters was located a short distance away from the Haneda International Airport in Tokyo. So yeah, the evidence is not ironclad, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that it was Sega. They had the means, the motive, the contacts, and all the evidence points at being Sega who's behind this. This is even more fitting when you consider that one of Sega's most popular gaming franchises today is the Yakuza series, a series of games which actually paints the Yakuza in a positive light. Or heck, how about the time they took Akira Nagai, who was Sega's managing director from 1965 to 2004, and had him cameo as a Yakuza boss in the Shenmue games.
Excuse me, but may I ask you something?
I hope I'm not rude, but who are you?
My name is Ryo Hazuki.
Ryo? I see. I heard about that incident. My condolences.
Man, this is just so insane, and it kind of shines a whole new light on Yuji Naka's arrest. For those unaware, Yuji Naka, the creator of Sonic the Hedgehog, was arrested last November due to insider trading. Now granted, he has not been with Sega for a long time, and he was employed at Square Enix during this period. But it does show that the company that originally made him famous had a lot of ties to the criminal underworld.
Sorry I'm late. I'm Kazuma, an associate of the Dojima family.
I didn't expect you to come, Kazuma-san.
When you don't pay your debts, I'm what you get.
It's easy to blame Sega for its ties with the Yakuza, but as I mentioned before, at one point, even Nintendo had ties with these groups. The truth is that pretty much the entire Japanese gaming industry was connected to the Japanese criminal underground at one point or another. For example, Roy Ozaki, a developer at Data East, told how the Yakuza would extort protection money from gaming companies by selling them calendars which would cost thousands. And if a Yakuza paid you a visit, you would simply show them your calendar as proof that you paid your protection fees. One developer who wished to remain anonymous even stated that every Japanese company was funded by the Yakuza.
All the video game companies were funded by Yakuza. Forget this story. It could topple the whole game industry in Japan. This might put your life in danger.
That's right, not just Sega or Konami, but all of them. Some, like Nintendo and apparently Namco, were seemingly able to break their ties at one point or another, while others were not. But now, 20 years later, did Sega break their ties to the Yakuza? Or did Nintendo and Namco re-establish their own ties? Surely things are getting better, right?
This godfather is the head of a declining empire. It is only made up of around 40 men today, and half of them are in prison.
I'm sure we've all seen a news article, forum post, or YouTube video about how the Yakuza are a thing of the past.
The Yakuza is almost dying now. I'm not sure they would be even exist in Japan in 20 years.
Yeah. Japanese police are, for the most part, bored as fuck because there's barely any crime that happens.
They're often joked about being online. I've seen this a lot about being just babysitters.
Or how Japan is cracking down on organized crime. Or how the Yakuza are dying out, that they're a relic that is quickly aging out and are now shunned by Japanese society.
In the last 10 years, highly restrictive anti-Yakuza legislation has made life as a member of the Yakuza dysfunctional.
Here's the thing though, I don't believe this. Yes, the street-level Yakuza who go around demanding protection money and starting turf wars are indeed on the verge of disappearing, though they are now being replaced by street-level gangs of underage kids, but that's besides the point. But the thing is, the Yakuza did not disappear, they simply evolved. Now they're performing white-collar crime, embezzlement, tax fraud, insider trading, that sort of thing. For example, they now fund Japanese social video games, so it's pretty clear that they are still involved with the gaming industry. But more importantly, according to the Japanese National Police Agency, the Yakuza are the biggest private equity owners in Japan, holding key positions in over 200 publicly traded companies, many of which are household names in Japan. From banks and trading companies to gaming, gambling, idol groups, and even anime studios, the Yakuza is still very much a force to be reckoned with in Japan. And this is what I meant when I said that I don't know if Sega or even Nintendo still have any involvement with them. As according to Japanese authorities, the mob did such a good job at infiltrating these companies that it is now virtually impossible to discern the difference between legal and illegal funds as they flow through the Japanese markets. I mean, heck, we've even seen anime shows that parody the fact that the idol industries are all owned by the Yakuza. So I think that it's pretty much an open secret that they have their hands on everything. Maybe one day I'll do a sequel to this video, and we'll take a closer look at how the Yakuza influenced gaming during the 80s and 90s. But for now, I think we've delved deep enough into a topic that is as interesting as it is depressing to think about. In the meantime, I'd like to thank all my Patreon supporters and the newest member to the Stika Patreon crew, Tomenza. Thank you for helping make the channel better. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!